Welcome to biology. In our first module, we are dealing mainly with the basics of life, and the first section is on the 8 characteristics of life. I do want you to be aware that in some textbooks, they may mention 9 or 10 different characteristics of life, but we are going to focus on these 8 here. Also, just a fair warning that there are some sounds within this PowerPoint presentation, which I have attempted to turn off, but evidently I'm doing it wrong. So I'll try and keep that to a minimum. So number 1, in order to be considered living, the organism has to be made up of cells. Unicellular organisms are made up of one cell, hence the prefix here, uni, that means one, so one cell. Multicellular organisms are made up of more than one cell, kind of like me and you. Cells are the smallest unit of an organism that can be considered alive. So even this paramecium, which is a microscopic pond protist or organism, is made up of cells. And of course, a dog is made up of cells. The paramecium would be considered a unicellular organism. The dog would be considered a multicellular organism. Number 2, living things reproduce. There's 2 types of reproduction. One is sexual reproduction. This is the mixing of genetic material from 2 members of the same species. In other words, you have to have a male and a female. Asexual reproduction, offspring are genetically identical to the parent, and there's no mixing of genetic material. In other words, you do not need a male and a female. There are some organisms like yeast that simply produce what's called budding, or they split apart in order to create their offspring. So in this one here, like with us, we have to have an egg and a sperm cell, so we use sexual reproduction. And in yeast, it's what's called budding, and because it's identical, we say they're basically clones of one another. They are identical to both the parent and to one another. Number 3, living things are based on a universal genetic code. In other words, we're talking about our DNA here. All organisms store the complex information they need to live, grow, and reproduce. And all of this is written in a molecule called DNA. And you already know this is found in the nucleus of your cells. Number 4, living things grow and develop. During development, a single egg divides again and again. New cells can be created and differentiate to perform certain functions for the organism as time passes. So even in an organism like yeast that goes through asexual reproduction, they still grow and develop into a mature or adult organism. So for example, we have a blue oak acorn in the seed form, and then we have the blue oak tree sprouting. So that's just an example of how that seed or that acorn actually start to develop growth, and it's going to produce leaves and stems and so on. Number 5, living things have the ability to metabolize. Energy is obtained and used to grow, develop, and reproduce. All of that requires energy. Here's our definition for metabolism: the combination of chemical reactions as it carries out its life processes. So everything that happens inside our cells that's going to help us grow, going to help us develop, going to help us reproduce, all of those are controlled by chemical reactions. All living organisms are able to take in energy from their environment and use it for life processes. The number 1 source of energy for the planet is the sun. For example, plants will use the sunlight for photosynthesis, while we will then eat those plants and other animals. We're going to take in that food. We're going to metabolize those nutrients. That's going to help us grow, develop, and reproduce. Living things respond to their environment. So we're talking about a stimulus. Living things respond to stimuli to improve their chances for survival. A stimulus is a signal to which an organism responds. So, for example, if I walked past one of you and I poked you in the ribs, you might kind of flinch a little bit. So the stimulus was me poking you in the ribs, and then you did a response for that. Another example, light and temperature, what's called phototropism. That's when plants will respond to sunlight, so they'll grow towards the sunlight. When you're cold, you start to shiver. When you're hot, you start to sweat. If you get dust in your eye, you may blink a lot more than what you normally would. If you inhale pollen, you may start to sneeze. Number 7, living things maintain a stable internal environment. Organisms need to keep conditions inside their bodies as constant as possible. This is called homeostasis. In other words, when you start to heat up, your body's going to respond and you're going to start to sweat to try and cool your body off. When you become hungry or thirsty, your body's going to respond. It's going to cause you to want to take a drink, or it's going to want to cause you to want to eat. Your blood sugar has to be maintained at a certain level. Your calcium has to be maintained at a certain level. And in this little graphic here, we have Homer. For example, we're using temperature here. So when the temperature increases, that's going to send a signal to your brain. There is a spot in your brain called the hypothalamus, which is not represented here. And that's the sensor. And it's going to send out a response to your body. It's going to tell you, okay, we need to sweat in order to cool this temperature down. Same thing if the temperature gets too cold. You're going to send out a sensor here in your brain. It's going to tell the body, you know what, we need to warm up. So let's contract those muscles and let's do a little bit of shivering, and that will produce our heat. Number 8, taken as a group, living things evolve. Now, when it says taken as a group, that means that not just one individual evolves by itself. The entire population evolves over time. Basic traits individual organisms inherit from their parents usually do not change. However, depending on what's happening in the environment, over many generations, groups of organisms typically evolve or change over time. This is a picture of Charles Darwin over here. He went to the Galapagos Islands. He is well known for studying the Galapagos finches. And over time, they have developed different size beaks in order to feed on certain foods that are found on those islands. And then over here, we have the Galapagos tortoises as well. We'll get into his studies a little bit later in the course. So those are the 8 characteristics of organisms in order to be considered alive. So kind of think about this. We have feathers. Just by themselves. Are feathers alive? If I light a candle or a match, is that alive? What about a bean? Is that alive? This is yeast again. Is yeast alive? And a virus. We're going to come back and talk about viruses in a little more detail because that's kind of a tricky one when we start talking about whether or not it's living or not living.